record it yourself?
As long as it's being recorded, I'm not too fussed.
It is.
Yeah.
I'll just hit record then. Yeah. All right, we ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's bring him in. Hello and welcome. Come on in. So nice to see you. I've got you minimized there, but don't worry, later you'll get a chance to see everyone in full screen. My name's Aveline. I'm your host, and we'll just wait another minute or two for a few more people to arrive on the clock here. Welcome to the event. I'm very excited. It's been about 2 months since our last event, and this is our first one where we've got one of our 6-star community members actually presenting on behalf of 6-star. And I've known Rob for a long time, and I'm very excited to have him here. So we are just going to wait for a couple more people, and then we're going to get started. 4:02. I hope you've had a good day wherever you are in the world. I think most people will be in Australia, given the time zone. There might be a few daring ones getting up nice and early from the UK. I have made it so that everyone is muted upon coming into the room, but you can come off mute if you need to talk when we get to Q&A time and that kind of thing. So we did have a lot more people registered, but I also account for the fact that I said please register in order to get a copy of the replay because of the time zone differences. So there's people in the UK and also Europe and America that certainly wouldn't have worked out for them. And so yes, we are recording. All right, I'm going to get started so that we are on time. So for those of you who don't know me, Aveline Clark. Actually, I have a slide, and it's a very quick slide. That's me. Hopefully, I still look like my picture. I'm founder of 6-Star Business and also my other business called Journey Point. I host the 6-Star Business podcast. Yes, I have a cat. She's meowing behind me in the background. And I love nature, people, and I love my cat most of the time. Yeah, except when she decides to sit on my desk when I'm starting an event. Okay, I have just a couple of boring stuff to get through, which is the housekeeping. I just ask that we turn off distractions. So mobile phones on silent, computer notifications, which is always something we forget. If you're on mute, that's great. But of course, if you come off mute at any time in the session, just be wary of that. Be open to the new. This is new stuff. It's even new material for me, and just have that open mind and see what comes out. And engage with us in the chat. So if at any time during Rob's masterclass, he brings up something, a question, please put it in the chat. So I'll be manning the chat, and we'll read questions out at the end unless Rob specifically asks for people to speak, okay? So yes, definitely use the chat. And the replay, if anyone would like a copy of the replay sent to them, even though you're attending live, just pop it into the chat. Let us know. All right, that is me and my introduction. I now get to introduce my friend Rob, whom I've known for, I think it's about 7 or 8 years. It could be longer. He's been an amazing member of the 6-Star community, and he was also a co-author in the How to Be a 6-Star Business book that we published. And here he is. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our presenter, Rob Drummond.
Thank you, Av. Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen. Okay, let me know if you can see a screen just for my sanity that says how to identify your core selling story. Thumbs up. Splendid. Okay. So today's session, I'm aware that, whether it's early or late for you, everyone's busy. So, is this a good use of your time? I think you're on the right webinar, you're on the right session. if in some sense you are a pioneer. And what I mean by that is that you have a unique, purpose, mission, system, process, community outcome. You do things differently. This isn't your first time around the business block. You've been going for a while. You are an expert in what you do. However, you're looking to build deeper, authentic connections with an audience of people that you serve who have the problem that you solve. And you can almost, in a sense, you understand the problem that they have better than they do. You can see it, but putting that into words and getting them to see that too is one of the key problems. Once they understand the problem as you see it, then they're great prospects. You work with them for a long time, but it's getting them to that point in the first instance. You have a sense that your story matters. Perhaps you've presented at networking meetings occasionally. Perhaps you've shared the odd personal story. Maybe people come up to you afterwards and say, that actually resonated a lot. Thank you for sharing it. But maybe you have reservations about telling it in your marketing. It's not something that we're taught to do. We're taught to talk about features and benefits and be very rational. And actually, it's a little bit counterintuitive, because by sharing our story, by telling our story, we're actually taking a less direct route to the sale. We're actually focusing on us initially more than perhaps the customer and the customer's problems. So it creates these sort of nagging doubts when you start telling your story. Like, am I just being self-indulgent? Oh, once you start telling your story, it's the questions then is like, well, you've got all of this experience, or you've done all of these things. Where do you begin? I think the place to begin is what I call your core selling story, and that's what we're going to talk about on today's session. First, just a little bit about me, especially if you are not familiar with me. So I am a father of two, a husband of one. My kids are in the next room. It is toddler feeding time at the moment, so if they burst in, I do apologize. I am many things, like all of us. I'm full of contradictions. I have many labels. I am a barefoot runner in the temperate seasons. In recent years, I seem to have been a truth seeker. I think there's a lot of interesting things happening at the moment. I'm also an author. As I've mentioned, I contributed, if you can see my camera, but I contributed to the 6-Star Business Book. I also have a book called Simple Storytelling, which outlines my methodology of business storytelling. In my work, I'm a copywriter, I'm a writing coach, and I also believe in authentic marketing. There's this big question in my mind of, is marketing worth saving? Can we fix it? And I think that actually for business owners who are providing a really valuable service to a specific audience, I think marketing is worth doing, because you have to get your message out there. People need to hear what you have to offer. And I'm a believer in doing that authentically and doing that from your core self. In my business, what I really do is I help pioneering business owners to be seen as the leading experts in their niche without needing to generate hundreds of leads a day, or otherwise funding the Facebook Christmas party. I do that through my story mapping process, which, the output of which enables you to nurture authentic connections with your ideal clients. And we're going to explore a section of that story mapping process today, because, well, I'll come to that in a sec. I'm also slightly obsessed with rugby league. So I follow a local team called Sheffield Eagles. And just this weekend, I went up to Newcastle to watch Super League for the weekend, and also drink very expensive beer out of 2-pint plastic cups. I live in Sheffield, in northern England. I say the north. If you look at the UK, Sheffield's pretty much bang in the middle. We are a city of brewing and a city of green spaces, which for me at the moment means it's a great time to be outdoors, to run barefoot in parks. So yeah, it's a great time to be in the north of England at the moment in June. Before I get you thinking about some of your own stories and how to rank them, how to identify the ones that really matter, I'd just like to share one of mine. It's one of the candidates for my core selling story. It's not necessarily the one, but it's just to get you thinking. So I'd like to take you back to March 2020. My wife, Lindsay, was 28 weeks pregnant with our second child. And things were going fairly well. The pregnancy had gone quite well. We were a bit worried because my son Hugo was born prematurely. He was born at 34 weeks, which for the men on the call is about 3 or 4 weeks earlier than is what is considered term. But things were going quite well. It was the start of March. The sun, the light had started to come back. We'd just been to a farm with some friends, and we were chatting and saying, "Oh yeah, well, we hope the last months are going to go really well." The next day, Lindsay went to the hospital for a routine checkup, and she had signs of preeclampsia. So preeclampsia is a collection of symptoms that nearly always means that the baby is going to be delivered early. Ultimately, if it's left unchecked, it's dangerous for both the baby and mother. And we just knew, because this happened with my elder son, we just knew that this was the start of a very long road. This was not going to get better. So Lindsay went to hospital. She actually took a huge bag with her. She actually moved in like she was moving into a hotel. So overnight, I went from having a wife and son at home to just basically being a single dad and trying to figure out, well, how do I entertain the 2-year-old as he was then? How do I also run a business? How do I find time for anything? So I've got a huge, for anyone who's been a single parent, I have a huge amount of respect just from my few weeks sampling that. Time went on. Lindsay stayed in hospital. Preeclampsia symptoms got worse, and eventually the doctors said, "Look, we're going to deliver the baby tomorrow. To minimize the chance of brain damage to the baby, we're going to deliver some magnesium through the IV drip." It's exactly the words I wanted to hear. They also asked us, because this was March 2020 and there was news of a novel coronavirus on the horizon, they asked us if they could use our birth as a trial run for a live COVID patients. So instead of the usual scrubs, the surgeon, so it was a section, a cesarean section, the surgeon and the anaesthetist and everyone, we're all wearing massive hazmat suits. If you think about the scene from E.T., where everyone, towards the end, it's a little bit like that. I remember a few things on that day. I remember the extreme cheerfulness of the anaesthetist. I remember various numbers being written on the board, which were times. One was KTS, knife to skin. I remember the huge hum of the extractor fans above the operating table. I remember Rumour being whisked past, blue and angry, towards the neonatal team at the back of the room. I remember going to see her with a little mask on, a small oxygen mask, watching her chest heave up and down in an attempt to breathe. After that, Rumour was whisked away to the neonatal intensive care unit. She wasn't the smallest baby or the sickest baby in there by any stretch, but she was on the smaller side. She was born at 3 pounds exactly. And I went home. Not long after that, the hospital staff caught wind that Hugo had a cold. So we were told in no uncertain terms that due to the risk of infection and whatnot, we were told that me and him had to stay at home for a week. We had to self-isolate for a week. So no visiting the newborn baby, no visiting my wife. Fortunately, Lindsay had managed to stay in the hospital. So I had a week of questioning, how do I feel? Do I feel okay? And the answer that came back was often no, but you have to hold it together. After a week, I used to come in and would swap every lunchtime. I'd swap with Lindsay. Lindsay would take Hugo out to a park for a few hours, and I would go and sit with Rumour in neonatal intensive care next to an incubator. And you can get the babies, once they're not very small, you can get the babies out of the incubators. And they got all of these tubes and things that are measuring blood oxygen saturation and heart rate and things like that. And there's various alarms on the monitors, various distinct alarms. So one of the ones that tends to go off is the DSAT alarm, which is the oxygen desaturation. So for Rumour to be sent home from hospital, she had to have a full week where she didn't set off the DSAT alarm. And there was one lunchtime where I was sat there, she sat there falling asleep on my chest, having some really nice skin to skin time. And then all of a sudden the alarm starts bleeping, you hear drood, drood, drood. And the nurses in there are very adept at glancing at the alarm and not appearing overly concerned. The parents are all panicking. The parents are all like looking around, wondering whose baby it is. And I'm thinking, oh no, that's going to be another week of coming in, swapping over at lunchtime, holding things together, looking after Hugo, being a single parent. I was there at one of these sessions where the staff were doing handover. So twice a day at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., the staff in the neonatal intensive care unit do handover. So the people who've been performing miracles, doing great work all day with a set of very small, very sick babies, hand over to a completely different new set of people. They compare notes on each baby. They talk through what's happened for each baby. And it struck me in that moment that there was real collaboration going on. Nobody was winging it. Everyone was following process. Everyone was following procedure. Detailed notes were kept. There was an escalation procedure. You know, if a baby got really sick, there were teams above that could step in and deal with the problem. And I sat there thinking, you know what, marketing could learn something from this. In particular, copywriting could learn something from this. I think that copywriting could be a more collaborative engagement where we work to processes, where we develop processes, where we actually speak to each other, where we actually specialize in particular areas, in particular niches. And that's what I want. That's what I want going forwards. I should have shared that slightly earlier in the story, but that was rumored just after she was. That was a couple of days after she was born, and that was on one of our lunchtime sessions where she kept on setting off the DSAT alarm. So, in thinking about a story, so a lot of you on the call today are new to me. You know, you're not familiar with me. You're not familiar with my body of work. You haven't got off and read my book yet. You haven't got off and read my book yet. I'm going to use the word yet. So I only get to tell you one slice of my story. And if you are face to face, in reality, you might have a set of stories. You might have a set of stories that you use in different circumstances and to different people, depending on who you're talking to. But online, you can't do that. And whether you're presenting on a webinar, whether that's where someone first connects with you on LinkedIn, whether that's when someone first opts into your email list, you only get to tell one story initially. It could even be as simple as someone has browsed to your website and browsed to your About Me page. And your About Me page is the absolute best page to tell your core selling story. But you only get to pick one. So it's like picking a slice of a Terry's chocolate orange. I was given a few Terry's chocolate oranges at Christmas last year, and I gave one to my son Hugo and watched him try to eat it, which is deeply irresponsible parenting. But he couldn't do it. He ate a few slices, his chocolate drooling all down his mouth. You also don't want to tell too much of your story in one go. You have to just pick a slice. Otherwise, you become like the crazy person at the back of the bus that won't stop talking about themselves, and everyone kind of eventually starts to avoid you. So you have to pick one. And the key question, the main thing to ask in selecting this story isn't the relevance to your work. It isn't, you know, how well does this correlate to your current line of work? The question is, does the story illustrate the purpose of your work, the mission of your work? Does it illustrate your core values in an emotionally powerful way? And the keywords are emotionally powerful way, because it's the emotionally powerful aspect that is going to cause people to remember the story, and because they remember you, because they remember the story, they will associate you with that story. So my definition of a core selling story is, and I should add that these notes are on the handouts. So I think I might have made a handout available. We'll also add it to, I'll make sure it's added to the chat before the end of the session. So these notes will get sent around. My definition of a core selling story is it's a story that sits at the heart of your marketing right after people opt in or enter your world. So you should tell it when you first have someone's attention, because it's a more personal story, because in some respects you're bearing your soul a bit. It's maybe not the first thing that you share with people before you have their attention. This isn't like a lead generation technique. This is a tool for being more vulnerable, being more authentic, presenting more of you to the people who are already, in some respects, already in your world and are already looking at you. We're not too fussed on media. So this could be email, it could be website, it could be webinar, presentation, etc. And you should only tell it after someone has raised their hand and expressed interest. as I said, it's to illustrate the purpose of this is to illustrate the purpose and the vision behind your work. It does not have to be directly related to your line of work. One final thing before I be quiet and get you to think about some of your stories. So your course selling story might not necessarily be a big event. So I took this photo in 2019 in the town of Yurimaguas in northern Peru, which is on a tributary of the Amazon. So it's a big river. Now, what you can do from Yurimaguas is you can travel by boat for a day down the river to a place called Lagunas. And from Lagunas, you can do a tour of the Pacaya Samiria Reserve, which is a wetland reserve where you can go and spot pink dolphins and butterflies and crocodiles and also all sorts of amazing wildlife. Now, I spent about 3 days in a boat with my guide here, who was called Roberto. And in selecting your stories, often what we're doing is we're in the weeds rather than in the big events. Often we're delving around in the smaller rivers of everyday occurrences. And often the stories that matter, often when they happen, they don't show up as big stories. It's only when you kind of analyze them in retrospect that you think, well, actually, when I share it, is it emotionally powerful? Does it build this connection? You know, it doesn't. I mean, the story that I shared about the birth of my daughter was probably a big event, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be, you know, the big life-changing point. It could just be something a little bit more routine, but at a point where you were really challenged. And actually, on the tour that I did of the Pacaya Samiria Reserve, I was quite challenged because Roberto literally spoke no English. I spoke traveler's Spanish, and we had 3 days in a boat together. That was one of my overriding memories, was making small talk in Spanish for 3 days in a boat. I'd also like you to just think, thinking back to my About Me slide, how many story threads are there here? There's actually quite a few. I mentioned my family. I mentioned some of my hobbies, some of my interests, some of my barefoot running quirks. I mentioned my location. I mentioned Sheffield. None of these things specifically actually are a course selling story in terms of what I would place right after someone enters my realm. But often in telling a story, the act of telling a story causes other story ideas to bubble to the surface. So often to uncover your course selling story, sometimes you have to just start telling a different one. That different story could be a story about how you went to Newcastle to watch rugby league at the weekend. Because often in doing that, there's related things as though, well, who did you go with? How did you get there? What challenges were there? So, you know, it's just something to think about. So I'm going to pause for a couple of minutes. And initially what I would like you to do, if you have a notepad handy, this is a good place to do this. But just have a bit of a think. I would like you to try and list, for starters, you know, if I was going through this with you in person, we might come up with, say, 40 or 50 or 60 stories, but just list initially, for starters, 3 to 5 stories. And what I'd like you to do is to think about, you know, things like key transformation events, you know, trips you've made, points where you have been, you know, specifically challenged on those trips, where you had setbacks. Have a think about, you know, when have you tried really hard and when have you really been out of your luck? And were you out of your luck because you were acting in a way that was not congruent with your core self? Those often make good course selling stories. I mean, I said that, you know, the course selling story doesn't have to be an event that led to your current line of work, but it could be. It could be something to do with the genesis of your current business. But again, it has to be emotionally powerful. Also have a think about 1 or 2 older stories of lessons from when you were young. Something I do with my clients is I'll get my clients to bring a couple of old photos to the call, because photos are visual. It helps us to put ourselves back in a situation. And again, imagine not just the story, but imagine who else was there, what else was happening, and also what else was happening at that time in your life. One of the things you can do here is if I said the word school to you, what do you think of? So for me, when someone says the word school, I think of PE lessons when we were about 14. And they used to make us do a 1-mile road run on the roads around school. And there was a lad called Mike who I was friends with, and he played prop for the school rugby team. Wasn't a good, he was a big guy. He wasn't a runner. And he ran out to the school gates. He jumped over the fence. He ran across the school field. He jumped over the fence on the other side and appeared back in about 4.5 minutes, completely covered head to toe in mud. So this, I mean, again, that's not a course selling story, but there's various things that story is about. It's about ingenuity. It's about shortcuts. It's about, in some respects, bravery, I think, to do that. So, there's various things that you could sum up about the story that you could use to connect to a message, to connect to your message, to connect to your sales pitch, if that's what you're doing. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to give you, so we're on 26 minutes past. I'm going to pause until about past. And then I'll explain my scoring criteria for ranking them. If anyone has any questions, I'm also happy to answer any questions at this point.
So Rob, are we just sort of listing like, oh, it's when I was, hiking, or when, I went with this person. So it's just like the summary of that story, not necessarily full detail.
What the story is, yeah.
Okay.
I don't, at this point, I wouldn't necessarily go into what is the end tale of the story. Obviously, in thinking about a story, the next step would be, well, you have to decide what the start and the stop points are in the story. Because obviously, your stories aren't static. So actually, if I jump ahead a bit, one story kind of evolves into another. So obviously, I tell the story about Ruma's birth, but Ruma has now grown up into a Mardy 3-year-old who's probably going to invade this webinar at some point and demand Weetabix. And she's keeping us up all night because she toddles into our bed at like 3 in the morning and invades our bed. And then because we have a double bed, I end up putting my pillow where my feet usually are. And because otherwise she just kicks me in the head. So if she's kicking me in the ankle, that's actually a lot better. Again, there's various applications for that story. It could be hardship. It could be making do. It could be, the putting your pillow where your feet is. That's invented this, maybe. I don't know. So, so in the telling of the story, you have to decide where to start and where the stop point is, because I can't tell the story of my daughter in one go. You just pick a slice. Normally the story is centered around a location. Normally there's some kind of there's a location and there's some movement or there's some action in that location. And that action and that movement and that action could be centered on you. It could be you moving somewhere or doing something or having something done to you. There's usually some pressure on you as well. If you think about every great story places pressure on the protagonist, and it's the pressure that causes the protagonist to grow and change. And it's the growth and change that is the arc of the story that delivers the moral of the story. Just for anyone who's jumping ahead, I'll just move to the next slide. So to repeat it, what we're trying to do is we're trying to just pick, if someone has discovered us digitally and we don't know anything else about them, but they've given us a slice of their attention, they've given us a slice of their time, in some respects, they've expressed interest. What story do we tell them? What story do we tell them that's going to communicate the big idea of your work, but also expose a little bit about you in the process? So I'd like you to consider the following scoring criteria. So we're going to ask a few questions of each story. And again, don't agonize too much about each number. I would give each one, a gut feel. Just ask the question, see what number comes to your head. But the first one is, how high were the stakes? So if the story had gone wrong, if a bad outcome had happened, what's the worst thing that could have happened? So for Rumour and her birth, obviously the stakes were very high. We're talking about the life of young infants. For the story about my mate Mike running across the muddy school field to shave off 4 minutes of the school road run, it's an amusing story, but the stakes weren't very high. And then I want to think about the degree of extreme personal challenge. One of the reasons I selected the birth of Rumour wasn't just the facts of the birth and the fact that it was a premature birth and she was born very early. It was more to do with the challenges around it, the challenges of the incoming lockdown measures, the challenges of also having a 2-year-old at home, the challenges of being told that we had to self-isolate for 7 days. So what degree? And again, be fairly honest with it. Five is bang in the middle. 5 is not a bad score. Five is just bang in the middle. But then want to think about, what degree of conflict was there in the story? So conflict can take multiple forms. Obviously, there's physical conflict, which I imagine for most of us is relatively unusual. It could be emotional conflict. It could be a time when you argued by email with a manager or co-worker. Perhaps you had a boss who was, trying to prevent your progression. If it was a story about the genesis of your business, then perhaps it was a founder who you thought certain things about, and it turns out in the story that you ended up fighting on certain issues. That could be another. That's an example of a story that potentially would have a high number for conflict. Conflict can also be with yourself, which is what I call internal conflict. So it can be you fighting with yourself in your head, which you see a lot more in novels. If you read Anthony Trollope, he's got huge sections of internal conflict of, what am I going to do? Does she love me? Doesn't she love me? There's lots of that in novels, because the novel lends itself to its internal conflict, because it's much easier to present the inside of a character's head. You don't get very much internal conflict in movies because it's much more difficult to do. You have to use things like flashbacks and things like that. It's not impossible, but you see less of it. So movies tend to be more focused on, or movies tend to lend themselves to stories that are based more about physical conflict or potentially emotional conflict, because then you can use dialogue to demonstrate that conflict. And here's perhaps the big one. So the 5-second moment comes from a book called Storyworthy by Matthew Dix. Storyworthy is one of the few storytelling books besides mine that I strongly recommend you reading. And he says that in Storyworthy, Matthew Dix argues that all great stories have a 5-second moment that illuminates a key understanding, or in our case, a key misunderstanding that was holding you back. Because in illuminating that key misunderstanding, you're shining the light of insight for a potential customer who is also following the same path as you. And that is going to be the foundation of trust. In Storyworthy, Matthew Dix talks about Jurassic Park. And he was saying that the key moments in Jurassic Park isn't when they're driving away from the T-Rex. It's not where they're trying to escape from the velociraptors in the kitchen. It's when they're sitting in the tree and they're talking about, I forget the name of the characters now, but it's like all the way through, he's really against kids. He's really against kids. And then he lets it go and he's got an old fossilized dinosaur foot and he lets it drop to the floor. And that's him letting go of his old perspective. And after that, he becomes like a pseudo parent to the kids and they end up escaping. But that was the turning point in the story. That's the point at which everything's going to be okay, because the character change is complete. That was the 5-second moment. in my story with Rumor, you know, the 5-second moments in the pod that I tried to focus on was where I'm sitting there with her on my chest and the decel alarms going off, and there's this handover. It's the point of handover. That's the key moment in the story. If there is an obvious 5-second moment, it lends itself to using the story as a core selling story, because in the telling of it, you can slow down the story at that point. You can focus on that 5-second moments to make sure that you deliver the message of what you're trying to communicate with the story. So again, don't necessarily overthink it, but overall, once you add up those 4 numbers, you'll come up with a score out of 40. And again, it's an arbitrary score. By itself, it doesn't mean anything. But when you're comparing one story to another, it starts to give you a criteria for saying, well, which story should I place first? Should I place this story right after people enter my world? And it might be that some of the story ideas that you come up, you do still share, but maybe just not as the first one. Maybe they go a little bit later. Maybe they go in a different media. Maybe some stories go in email, because email is a very personal medium. If someone has opted into your email address, then they raise their hand and say, yeah, I want to hear about you. If someone has just connected with you on LinkedIn, you probably don't have that, arrangement yet. So there's some stories that lend themselves better to LinkedIn, and there's some stories that lend themselves better to email, potentially. In my book and in my work, I distinguish between what I call core stories and current stories. So out of this process, what you'll do is you'll come up with normally 8 to 10 core stories. And a core story is something that where you changed as a person. It's something that is some kind of pressure on you that caused you to change as a person, that helped you to develop the perspective you have today, that has helped you launch your business, develop your unique system, process, methodology. It's something in that journey. You'll obviously have other stories. I call the other stories current stories, because these are stories about current goings on. Me going to Newcastle to watch rugby league is a current story that literally happened last weekend. At the start of my, so I have a series in my email autoresponder sequences where I tell what I think is my core story sequence, but I preface it with what I initially wrote as a current story. The current story being the things I did last weekend, and the current story was about 4 months after my son Hugo was born. Lindsay told me that she was going to go for a haircut, and could I have Hugo for the afternoon? And I was like, shit. I've not had Hugo by myself for like 6 hours before. And she's like, it'll be okay. And I was a bit concerned because Hugo was being breastfed and I was not the provider of milk. So she went off for a haircut, and we're in Sheffield city centre, and he's eyeballing me from his pram seat. He's still kind of a baby, but he's not really a baby. He's turning into like an independent-minded pram dictator. And we walk around these shops, and you'd have to work out, like, will the pram fit in the shop? Is there enough space in the shop to move the pram about? Is he going to have a massive meltdown? And then eventually, you need to have a wee. And it's like, well, you can't just nip in somewhere to have a wee. You have to go into a bar. You have to go to the bar. You have to ask the bar staff for the radar disabled toilet key. You have to go to the disabled toilet. You have to hope to God that there isn't a nappy escaping poo in there, and there's nappy waiting for you. And then eventually I managed to have a beer and sat outside in the sun. But because he's with you, Hugo then goes and does his cute smiley thing and attracts this gaggle of middle-aged women who want to talk to him and want to talk to me. And I'm like, oh man, I just want to have a beer. And then I had to feed him. So he starts to cry. And I'm like, oh no. So we sat down under a tree. You have to wrap a bib around his neck. And I was like, I hope no one's filming me, because it really looks like I'm strangling my child. And you get this mush on a spoon and just like feed it in where you think his mouth probably is. And this went on for like 4 hours. And then at the end, I met up with Lindsay, and she was like, "Yeah, that sounds like my life, 24 hours a day." So I told that story in my email sequence as an example of a current story of something I'd done that weekend. But I've since reflected actually that it potentially is a candidate for a core story, because it's part of my journey of developing as a dad. And it's only in retrospect and thinking about it and me telling it now. There's a lot of humor in the story that especially the mums on the call might laugh at, of a dad fumbling his way around trying to feed a baby for the first time or whatever. So there's inherent humor in it, but there was pressure on me. You know, how high were the stakes? The stakes weren't very high. The stakes felt high because I'd just been given responsibility of a small human. So let's put the stakes at like 4. Degree of extreme personal challenge was probably 7, perhaps. Degree of conflicts is probably, well, it's probably about 4, but mostly that was with Hugo when he was crying. Was there a 5-second moment that illustrated a key misunderstanding? No, I don't think there was. I mean, there's various moments throughout the story. There's the moment where I'm having the beer and I get the gaggle of mums crowding around, and there's the moment where I try to feed him and I'm worried that someone might be filming me to put it on YouTube. So yeah, there's various moments, but there's not a specific moment. There's not a specific thing where I'm like, oh, that's the key turning point here. So I'd probably give that like a 3 potentially. I'm gonna be quiet for a couple of minutes. So I'd like to invite you. So obviously this is completely optional, but if any story ideas have come up for you and you would like to, share the outline of them with me, then I'd like to invite you to do that. And I will give you some initial feedback, initial comments on my feeling from hearing your version of the story. It's obviously fine. I know this is a public forum. It's obviously fine if no one wants to do that. And you're also welcome to email me afterwards. Some stories are ready to share. Some stories are ready to share one day. And some stories are just not ready to share publicly. But if anyone does have a story you would like feedback on, then feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself. Karen's got her hand raised.
Karen, yeah. Thanks, Karen.
Hi, Karen.
Hi there. So this is really good because I use my story all the time when I introduce my business. So back in 2009, our entire region was affected by the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires, in which case I lost pretty much everything, and I had two surviving horses out of my 4 horses in the herd, severely injured, and then had to get evacuated. So trying to start back at that, what I had noticed after the horses recovered from their injuries, that my horse, the biggest horse, the pony was recovering okay, but the biggest horse seemed to have some mental challenges. So he was very spooky, which made him very dangerous. People were saying, I'm going to have to put him down because he's going to kill someone. And I said, no, he's been through too much. I couldn't possibly do that. I will do everything in my power to get him well again. Then I heard about equine-assisted therapy, and my interpretation of that was that it was therapy for my horse because my horse needed therapy. So I take him along to my first session. His name is Duke. He's a beautiful horse. He's actually one of my lead facilitators in the programs that I do now, which is equine-assisted learning. So I'm taking him along to get fixed, and they put him in the round yard, and his anxiety goes absolutely through the roof. He's running in circles in this space. He actually tried to climb out of a 6-meter fence wall. That's how desperate he was. And of course, watching him just made my heart rate go through the roof, and I'm thinking he's going to kill himself. He's going to kill himself. So I was highly emotional at that time. And after about 5 minutes, he wasn't really slowing down. So they invited me into the arena with him. And then he was still running around, and they looked at me and they said, I just want you to relax, Karen. And I'm going, how can I relax? He's going to kill himself. It's like horrible. And they said, just try and relax, Karen, and then just try and slow your breathing down and see how you go. So it's like, they said, just don't think of him as about to hurt himself or injure himself, but just think about him calming down and not kind of, and being still. So I did that, and then he started to slow down a little bit. Was by this stage he was in completely lathered from head to toe. And then they turned to me and they said, are you breathing, Karen? And I said with gritted teeth, and I remember feeling it. Once they asked me the question, I then turned inwardly to myself and said, yes, I am. And then once the words came out of my mouth, I noticed that my jaws were totally clenched and that I could barely move my face. And then they said, he said, just take a nice deep breath in and relax. And they said, how is your jaw? And I said, it's as tight as anything. And they said, just relax your jaw. And so I started focusing on what I had to do and forgot about, and kind of more about me and less about him. And then when I finally got to start breathing a lot slower, which was probably about 10 breaths later, he immediately stopped running around and was snorting, and then just walked into me and dropped his head as if to say, well, it's about bloody time.
Mm-hmm.
I was just waiting for you to calm down so I could calm down, because, and then it was explained to me that he was literally sensing from my tension and my PTSD at that stage that there must be something scary happening, because my energy, and even though I thought I was fine, I was in a little bit of denial, but my energy was up in that kind of heightened state of awareness, which was indicating to him, and he was picking up that there must be some danger around and that he has to get ready to go into flight mode to save himself again.
Yeah, thank you. I think that story is about relationships, obviously your relationship with your horse. And that, I think, is that inherently makes it powerful, potentially. I also think that pets are a good thread to talk on as well. And it could be a pet. It could be a current pet. It could be a pet from when you were growing up. It could be something that they did, or a time that they got lost. Again, because that's quite high stakes. You know, if your pet goes missing or whatever. I think in the telling, something I would think about. So something I try to get my students. So I ran this call a few weeks ago. An accusation that was leveled was a lot of the stories are quite to the bone. In some respects, there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of bad things happening. So it's trying to structure the story so that there are some good things happening as well. So if you think back to my story about my daughter, I opened up by saying that things were going well. We'd just been to a farm to see some friends. We're feeling good about the next 2 months. So there was a very deliberate. So that was deliberate. So you could open up the story by describing your horses and the beautiful paddock and where they live and your relationship with them, and then it goes wrong. And this is a plot. This is an archetypal structure. This is a structure that is used in literature, in movies. It's been used, documented. There's a good book actually on this called The 7 Basic Plots by Christopher Booker, and he analyzes stories going back right through since the written word has been recorded, and he documents that the stories that last do actually follow the same structure. So you get this call in the beginning. So the call is where you have this potentially you have an up. You describe the hobbits are in the Shire and think life is very good, but then things take a dark turn, and the path that you were on is no longer possible, and that could be because of the 2009 Is it floods you mentioned or fires? I think so. There's some kind of external pressure that means that you can't stay on that path. But then, you know, throughout the story, it's good to have a bit of up and down. I know that obviously in writing the story, it's a little bit different, and I just asked you to share the bare bones of the story, but there's probably a little bit of commentary, like you commenting on the events throughout the story, that took me out of the moments. And actually, when you got to the point where I realized that the story was about you, not the horse, that was quite powerful, because that was something that I wasn't expecting. That was like the insight that actually it's like, well, actually, maybe that does relate to me also. I could see what the moral of the story is, but there's maybe a little bit of commentary on things before that. And obviously that's difficult to do verbally. And I should add that I'm a better written storyteller than I am a verbal storyteller. And one of the reasons for that is because when you're working on a piece of writing, you can view these things, you can go back and you can rewrite it, and you can make sure that you're not commenting on the story as you tell it, and you keep people in the moment. You can make sure that you've got the ups and the downs. I think your story lends itself to internal conflict as well. You know, there's internal conflicts of you in your head battling on what to do, how to fix this, how to make it right. Maybe there's some shame. Maybe you, right or wrong, maybe you think it's your fault, or yeah, perhaps there's some internal conflict that you can draw on there as well. Yeah, thank you for sharing it. We have about 8 minutes, so if anyone does have another story, we can listen to it. If not, it's also fine. Elise, you got your hand up. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. I thought you said Louise. I thought it was someone else.
Good
I
morning,
haven't got
Oliver.
my camera on. Sorry. Good morning. I'm still in my pajamas. It's quite early. Yeah, I wrote down a story from sort of fairly early in my career, first few years in, and I was working for a company, and I'd had a couple of promotions, all each one bringing a bit more marketing and comms into my role, and then I was finally promoted to my first sort of full-time comms job. And about 3 months after I started, my boss, who was the comms manager, went on extended sick leave, and she was actually off for almost a year. So I was kind of acting up, taking on aspects of her job for around a year. And then she eventually left, and they started recruiting for a comms manager, which I applied for. And I was so excited about the opportunity of getting this next step up. And I thought, I've been doing it for a year, I'm a shoo-in, and I didn't get it. And they brought in an external person, and I was gutted. I was absolutely gutted, and I couldn't understand why I hadn't got it, because in my head I'd been doing the job for a year. But then the new manager started, and I think within 3 months of her being there, I completely realized why I hadn't got the job. She was amazing, and she did the job for about 18 months before moving on to a different role. And when she left, I reapplied and I got the job, and I realized that I had learned so much from her in that 18 months that I would not have learned if I'd been put in that role. I probably would have muddled through, but it wouldn't have been as good. The job wouldn't have been as good. Our team wouldn't have been as good. And so I think that was the first real experience for me to sort of appreciate that, sometimes when you don't get something that you want, it's not always a bad thing. I probably would have been thrown into that role. I wasn't quite ready for it. I didn't really know enough. And what I learned from my new boss, meant that when I did step into that role, I was so much better. And that everything I learned from her took me into the next role. She taught me about leadership. She taught me how to be a strong female leader, in sort of quite a male-dominated organisation. Like, she was a mentor. She continued to be a mentor after she left, and I'm still in touch with her now. So that I think that was quite a turning point. That's definitely one of those sort of transformation changes in my life that I could think of.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's quite an interesting one as well, because that's quite close to your current work. But I think the fact that you felt overlooked, that really came across to me in the story, and that kind of resonated. So something I try to get my students to do is to think like, well, what if you had to distill the story to a single word, what would that word be? So for me, it could be mentorship. It could be the initial word I wrote down was self-awareness. So then self-awareness becomes potentially like the bridge concept where you have the story and then you use self-awareness to kind of end the story and start your message or your content.
Yeah.
I know that you're a story professional and you already understand this, but I'm just for everyone else.
Yes, I definitely could have told it better, but
it's so difficult. It's so difficult when you're on the spot, you haven't prepared it, you're telling it verbally. It's tough. I think Matthew Dix, if you go and watch Matthew Dix's YouTube channel, he presents on the Moth. He's very, very good.
I will do. I've already got him written down, actually, from you were talking about him earlier.
Just as final next steps for me, and an invitation. So I do these calls every month, and the reason being is because I think if you're a business owner, if you're the voice of your business, there's no need to be stuck for ideas, for things to write about. Whether you're writing emails, whether you're writing social posts, there's no need to be stuck for the ideas. So what I do on these calls is I have a call like this each month where it's sort of 20-minute me presenting on the topic. So this month on the 16th of June, our topic is going to be exploring family stories. And a bit like today, I'm going to share a story about my granddad, who was an important person in my life when I was young. And it's just to get you thinking. Obviously, the act of listening to both my story and to the other people who shared stories, the act of listening to a story causes you to think about stories. And it's the act of empathy. It's how stories work. It's you placing yourself in the shoes of the storyteller. That's how storytelling works. So listening to other people's stories is, I think, the best way to cause your own stories to bubble to the surface, if you like. So the next call is on the 16th of June. You're obviously more than welcome to join. I do send a recording out, so it's in the afternoon UK time, which might be a bit late for Australia, but I do send a recording out of my part of the presentation. I don't send the discussion out. The discussion is only for people who are on the call. Place to go. Rather than give you a big list of links, I put everything in one place, which is storycopywriters.com/hello. You can subscribe to my email list, please do connect on LinkedIn. You can also book a coffee with me to discuss. Obviously, I have various programs, training courses, mentorship for people who want to go faster with this. And not just, so the monthly few workshops are about identifying the stories to tell. The paid services are then, how would you go about writing them? So the story that I told about rumor, I actually had a timeline on my desk as I was telling it. So there's this shape. I made sure there was ups. I made sure there was downs. I made sure that I ended the story on the one idea that would link to my message. So you can plan, you can plan these out, and if you get the plan right, it makes the telling of the story much easier. So feel free to book a coffee to discuss that. I just want to give Av a shout out as well. So a great place to connect would be the 6-star community. I think Evelyn maybe doesn't promote it. I don't think you shout about it enough, Av. I think it's a great place. I think, we're having these conversations regularly. So the 6-star community is another great place to connect. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. So grateful for that. I learned a lot. I'm not sure about everyone else. I'm sure you did, but it just highlighted to me that it does take a bit of planning. And for me, I've written down like 6 initial story ideas already. So there's work for me to do to delve in. And I want to just highlight a couple of things you said. One is that this is not lead generation. This is the step after someone first sees you. So they might have clicked on something on a social post or an ad or whatever it is, or an email, or they've met you, or, you know, so many different channels. And then this is the next step. So it's the getting to know you. And you mentioned also to have it on your about page on your website. And that is the most highly trafficked page of your website when someone goes to check you out. So that's great. And there's so much to this, and I think it's so powerful. And just in the 60 minutes, you know, there's been so much shared already, and the examples you gave were really, really strong. It's wonderful. I just want to share my screen, and thank you for the shout out as well. And yes, 6-star. If I got the right screen, yes, hopefully you can see my screen. Connect. There's Rob's email address. There's my email address if you're interested to find out more. 6-star podcast. We have a weekly podcast where I interview a guest, and there's some amazing stories there. One of the core themes in the podcast conversations are drawing on people's journeys. And yeah, connect on LinkedIn if we're not connected already. And I just want to thank you for coming. And yeah, it's just been amazing. So we do have these events every 1 to 2 months under the 6-star business brand and banner, and we'll definitely have another one soon. So look out for that as well. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate everything. And does anyone have any final questions? I noticed there was a couple of people that want the replay. I might actually just send it to everybody. And does anyone have any final questions? Comments? Feel free to come off mute. And oh, yes, thanks, Brad. I've got your question, and I'll get back to you, Brad, on that one. All right, thank you. Thank you so much, all. And thank you, Rob. It's been a pleasure. And
Yep, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Thanks, Av. Cheers.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Karen.